Sometimes one small decision is all it takes for the whole night to feel different. On this channel, we go through real stories from 4chan, the kind left behind by people who clearly had something to get off their chest. This case builds its tension in quiet moments rather than loud ones. Settle in, lower the lights, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's start. I hadn't set foot on that block since I was 11, and I only ended up there because my connection out of LaGuardia got pushed to the next morning, August 2021. Everything in the city was still half open, half shut. Signs on doors about masks. Fewer people than there should have been on a Saturday. I had a hotel room near the airport, an afternoon to burn, and this dumb little urge I couldn't shake. I wanted to see the old apartment. We used to live on a quiet block off 74th in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. 6-story walk-up, red brick, fire escape that rattled if a bus went past. My mom moved us out in the winter of 2001, right after everything, and I hadn't been back since. Not once. Not for a friend's wedding, not for a funeral, nothing. When people from the city asked where I grew up, I'd just say Brooklyn and change the subject. I took the R down and walked the last few blocks with my hands in my pockets, kind of laughing at myself. I don't know what I expected. The block was almost exactly the same. Same crooked sycamore in the middle of the sidewalk. Same laundromat on the corner, though the sign was blue now instead of yellow. The bodega where my mom used to send me for eggs was still there, and the cat that lived in the window had been replaced by a different cat, but the cat was still there. That got me for a second, that there was still a cat. I walked slow. I was sweating through my t-shirt because it was one of those sticky August afternoons where the air just sits on you, and the AC units were dripping down onto the sidewalk in that pattern I used to jump between as a kid, trying not to get hit. I actually stepped around a couple of them out of habit, before I caught myself doing it. Then I got to the building. It looked smaller than I remembered. They always do. The stoop was the same, 5 steps up, iron railing painted so many times it was thick with it. Someone had put a planter next to the door with a plastic sunflower in it. I stood on the sidewalk across the street for a minute, just looking up at the 3rd floor. Our window, 4th from the left. The AC unit was still crooked. 20 years and nobody had straightened it. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting on the stoop of the building next door, in an old folding lawn chair, one of those green striped ones, undershirt, track pants, slippers, even though he was outside, coffee cup in his hand, the paper kind from a deli. He was watching me. Not in a mean way, just watching, the way old men on that block always watched. I nodded at him the way you nod at a stranger, out of politeness, and started to turn away. He said, "You came back." Not a question. He said it like he was finishing a sentence he'd started a long time ago. I turned back and looked at him properly, and something in my chest sort of tipped over. I knew his face. I couldn't place it right away. My brain kept trying to slot him in with the wrong context, like when you see your dentist at the grocery store. Then it clicked. He'd been the super, or something like the super, in the building next to ours. Ground floor apartment, right off the entrance. I used to see him hosing down the sidewalk in the morning. He gave out those hard butterscotch candies at Halloween. I said, "Mr. Sal?" He smiled a little, just the corners of his mouth. "You remember. You still live here? Where am I gonna go?" I laughed at that, and he laughed too, this dry, rattly laugh. And for a second it was just 2 guys catching up on a stoop. He asked if I wanted a coffee. I said, "No thank you." He asked where I was living now, and I told him, and he nodded, like he'd figured it was somewhere out there. He said his knees were bad. He said the block had gone soft, whatever that meant. Rent was crazy. The new kids didn't say hello, all the usual stuff. Then he said, "I always thought you'd come back one day, after what happened." He said it easy, not loaded, just true. I felt my mouth go dry. I knew exactly what he meant. There wasn't any confusion. My dad had a heart attack on that sidewalk, right in front of our building, on a Tuesday in November. I was 10. I was the one who was with him. I don't remember most of it clean. I remember pieces, the way his knee hit the concrete first and his hand hit second, the sound of the eggs breaking inside the paper bag because he'd just come back from the bodega. I remember running. I remember screaming up at our window for my mom and her not being at the window. I remember somebody, an adult, pulling me back so the paramedics could get in. And I remember, later, after, an old man in slippers standing in his doorway with his hand over his mouth. That was him. I hadn't put the face to it in 20 years, but the second he said it, I knew. He'd been there. He'd seen the whole thing from the ground floor window. He was the one who called it in. For a second, I couldn't say anything. I stood on the sidewalk with my hand on the iron railing, staring at that stupid plastic sunflower, and my ears did that thing where the traffic sounds seem far away. I hadn't talked about it in probably 15 years. Not to my wife, not to anyone. I mentioned once to a therapist in my 20s that my dad had died young, and I said the word cardiac like it was a line on a form, and she nodded and we moved on, and I never brought it up again. I opened my mouth and I didn't know what was going to come out. I thought maybe I was going to ask him what he saw, or if my dad had said anything. I'd wondered about that. For years, on and off, in the middle of the night sometimes, I'd wondered if he'd said anything before I got to him. I hadn't been more than 15 feet away. I was tying my shoe on the stoop. Sal must have seen my face. Because before I could get anything out, he did this thing with his hand. This small wave, like he was brushing something off the table between us. He said, "It's all right. It's past now." That was it. That was all he said. I don't know how to describe what that did. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like somebody I didn't even know had been carrying a bag for me for 20 years, and he just set it down on the sidewalk and said, "Okay, we're done with this." He didn't want details. He didn't want to tell me his version. He wasn't going to make me perform anything for him. He just wanted me to know that he remembered, and that it was fine to have remembered, and now we could talk about something else. So we did. He asked me if I remembered the guy who used to sell shaved ice out of a little cart on the corner in the summer. I said, "Yeah, blue syrup, the one that made your tongue look dead." He said the guy's grandson runs an ice cream place 2 blocks over now, if I wanted to check it out. He told me the sycamore had almost gotten cut down in 2015, and the block had petitioned to save it, and won. He asked about my mom. I told him she was in North Carolina, doing okay, watching too much news. He said, "Tell her Sal from the block said hello." I said I would, and I meant it. We stood there a few more minutes. A woman with 2 little dogs went past, and Sal said hi to the dogs by name, and ignored the woman, and the woman didn't seem to mind. A kid on a scooter almost took my elbow off. Sal yelled something after him in what I think was Sicilian. He drank the last of his coffee, tipped the cup back and shook it. He said his show was about to start, and he was going to head in. He put out his hand and I shook it. His hand was dry and warm and lighter than I expected. I said, "Thanks, Mr. Sal." He said, "Go on." And that was it. I could have walked back to the subway the way I came. That would have been shorter. But there was a service alley between our old building and the next one over that opened up into an inner courtyard, this little square of cracked concrete where the trash cans lived, and where all the kids on the block used to hang out because none of the parents could see us from the windows. We played handball against the back wall of the laundromat. Somebody's older brother had spray painted a strike zone on it in the 90s, and it was still there when I was 10, faded almost to nothing. I hadn't planned to go through the courtyard. I don't know why I did. I just did. The alley was narrower than I remembered, and it smelled like warm garbage and detergent from the laundromat vent. I ducked under a low pipe I used to be able to walk under standing up. My shoulder brushed the brick, and then I was in it. The courtyard was. The job came through a subcontractor in late September, and I almost passed on it. 3 weeks in a shuttered state hospital outside Danville, Pennsylvania, cataloging and hauling out medical equipment that had been sitting in the dark since 2018. Union rate, per diem, no overtime because there was no one to check overtime against. I took it because my wife was between contracts and our furnace was making a sound I did not want to think about. The place had a real name, but everyone in the county just called it the campus. 6 brick buildings on a hill, gated off from the road, the kind of long driveway that makes you slow the truck without deciding to. 3 years empty. State kept the power on at a trickle so the sprinkler system would not freeze. That was it. I worked alone. That is normal for what I do. Nobody wants to pay two guys when one guy with a liftgate and a manifest can clear a wing in a week. My contact at the state gave me a ring of about 40 keys and a laminated map with rooms crossed out in red marker. Red meant already emptied by whoever came before me in 2019, before the funding got pulled and the job stopped halfway through. Everything else was mine. First 2 days I did the easy stuff. Beds, IV stands, the wheeled carts they use for meds, all of it went into the trailer for the recycler in Scranton. Aluminum, steel, some copper wiring, nothing weird. The building smelled like every old hospital smells. Floor wax that had gone chalky, mildew in the drop ceilings, and under that a hint of the cleaning agent they used to use in the 70s. This pink stuff, the kind of smell that gets into a building and never really leaves. On the third day, I went into the C-Wing. C-Wing had been the long-term unit. That was in the file, not something I was guessing. The rooms up there still had the padded strips along the door frames, and the little observation windows with the wire mesh inside the glass. I did not linger. I have been in enough of these places that I do not tell myself stories about them anymore. It is a building. It is drywall and copper pipe. The ECT room was at the end of the north corridor, room C214. The door was heavier than the others, and it had a second lock, the kind that takes a square key instead of a round one. I had that key on the ring. It went in clean and turned without a sound, which honestly surprised me. Most of the locks in that building were stiff. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. One bed with the vinyl split down the middle, a rolling stool, and against the wall, a Somatics Thymatron, model DGX, one of the older green consoles. I recognized it because I had scrapped 2 of them in a hospital in Ohio the year before. This one still had the leads coiled on the hook and the mouthguard tray sitting on top of the machine, wrapped in a plastic bag that had gone brittle. The thing is, that unit should have been destroyed in 2018 when the clinic closed. That is protocol. You do not leave a functioning ECT device in an unsecured building, even a locked one. Someone had signed off on it staying. I was going to have a note in my report about that. I already knew. I pulled on my gloves and got out the manifest to log the serial. The serial plate was on the side of the console, and to read it, I had to crouch and shine my light behind the machine, into the gap between the unit and the wall. That is when I saw the cards. They were index cards, 3x5, held to the back of the machine with masking tape that had yellowed to almost brown. A stack of them, maybe an inch thick, fanned out and taped in a loose bundle so you could flip through them like a Rolodex. I could see handwriting on the top one, blue ballpoint, tidy little cursive letters, the kind of handwriting a nurse from the 70s would have. I stood up. I turned the overhead light on, the second bank, so the room got that flat white fluorescent that makes everything look one-dimensional. Then I got a box cutter and slid it under the tape and eased the whole bundle off. There were 142 cards. I know because I counted them twice, later, sitting in my truck. Each one had a name at the top, first and last. Under the name, a date of birth. Under the date of birth, a column of dates and small numbers, in that same tidy hand at first, then a different, blockier hand for the later dates. The numbers were session counts. I have done enough of this work to know what a session log looks like. Number of ECT sessions, cumulative. Some cards had 8, some had 20. 2 of them had over 60. 60 is not a number that is supposed to exist on a card like that. I sat on the rolling stool for a long time. Whatever else the cards were, they were not supposed to be on the back of the machine. Patient identifiers do not live with the equipment. They live in a chart, in a locked file room, and after the chart is closed, they live in a records warehouse under a retention schedule. You do not tape them to the thing that did the procedure. Nobody who has worked in a hospital ever would. I started flipping through, slowly, because I was already thinking about what to put in the incident report. I was looking for a pattern, a doctor's initial, a ward code, anything that would tell me who to hand the stack to. About a third of the way in, I stopped. The name on the card was a name I knew, not from around here, from television. A man who has been on a certain nightly show, on a certain cable network, for a long time. His date of birth matched the year I would have guessed, if you had made me guess. 22 sessions between 1994 and 1996, according to the numbers. I read the card 3 times. Then I set it aside on the bed and kept going. 4 cards later, another one. A woman this time. A senator's wife, or she had been, back when her husband was still in office. I remembered her from a magazine my mother used to have on the coffee table. 9 sessions, all in one summer, 1988. I want to be clear about something. I was not excited. I was not thrilled to be finding this. My hands were doing a thing where they were shaking a little, and I put the cards down and went to the truck and drank half a bottle of water and stood in the parking lot for maybe 10 minutes before I went back in. By the end, I had flagged 6 names I recognized. 2 politicians who are still in office, a musician my wife likes, a man who runs a company you have heard of, a local news anchor from Philadelphia, which honestly rattled me more than the national ones, because I had watched him do the weather when I was a kid. And one more I am not going to describe, because if I describe him, you would know who he is, and that is not a decision I am ready to make for him. All of them alive. I checked that night on my phone, sitting in the motel in Bloomsburg, still working, every one. Older than the dates on their cards, obviously, but there, findable, on Wikipedia and LinkedIn and the front pages of newspapers. I did not sleep well. I want to say that plainly and move on, because I know how that kind of sentence can become the story, and it is not the story. The next morning I went back to C214 with my phone, and I photographed every card, front only. I laid them out on the bed in rows of 10, and shot them from above with the flash off, so the fluorescent light did the work. It took about an hour. I was careful with the tape residue on the backs, so the cards would go back exactly how I found them. I do not know why I was careful. Habit. Then I did my job. I logged the serial. I disconnected the leads, drained the small internal capacitor per the manual, unbolted the unit from its base, and by the end of the day the console was on the trailer with the rest of the ferrous scrap. It went to the shredder in Scranton on the following Monday, along with the leads and the mouthguard tray and the stool. I watched it go into the hopper. That is also protocol. You watch. The cards I put back on the back of the machine before I moved it, taped in the same bundle. They went through the shredder with the console. I made that choice standing in the room, and I have thought about it a lot since. The photos are on a hard drive that is not connected to anything. I made a copy. The copy is at my brother-in-law's house, in an envelope inside a book he will never open, and he does not know it is there. When I got home, I called a lawyer a friend of mine used for a malpractice thing a few years back. She works in medical records law in Harrisburg. I described the situation without naming names. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "That is a hard one." She said the cards, once they were destroyed, were gone as evidence, and the photos were a chain of custody problem, and that if I went to a reporter, I would probably be the one who got sued, not the hospital, because the hospital does not exist anymore, and the state would not want the story. She said if I wanted to try, she could point me at someone, but she was not going to tell me to do it. I have not called any of those people. I have thought about it. The news anchor from Philadelphia is the one I think about the most, which does not make sense. He is the least famous of them. But I watched him when I was 9 years old, standing in the kitchen while my mother made dinner. 12 sessions in 1991. He is 71 now, and he still does the noon broadcast. I do not know what I would say to him. That is the honest part. I have the photos, and I have his name written down in a notebook in my desk. And I have opened the notebook maybe 6 times since last year, and every time I close it again and go do something else. The furnace, by the way, was the igniter, $90 and an afternoon. Most of my calls in April are raccoons. That's the season. They're moving into attics and crawl spaces looking for somewhere to drop their kits, and half of the parish knows my number because I don't upsell. And I don't lie about how bad the problem is. The call came in on a Tuesday, second week of April. Everything was already strange that spring because of the shutdown. Half my regular jobs had dried up, and I was taking anything that came through. The guy on the phone said his name was Marcel. Older voice, French accent thick enough that I had to ask him twice for the address. He said he had something in his basement, moving around at night, big enough to knock things off the shelves. He'd heard it 3 nights in a row and he wanted it out. The address was a lot off a 2-lane road south of Denham Springs, one of those long parcels with a gravel drive and chain link around the backyard. Old ranch house, aluminum siding, bug zapper light on the porch. When I pulled in, Marcel came out. Skinny, maybe 60, wearing a Saints t-shirt 2 sizes too big. He walked me around the side and pointed at the basement door. "I don't go down there," he said. "I don't like it down there. Whatever you catch, you take it, yes?" I said, "Sure, that's the job." He handed me a key on a little brass ring and went back inside. Didn't offer coffee, didn't ask about the price. In this parish, that's unusual. People here talk your ear off. The basement was concrete block, half underground. One of those setups you see in the older houses where the ground floor sits on a raised foundation. Single bulb on a wire. The smell was mildew, standard for anything down here in April. But under that was something rank and animal. Urine and old meat. Shelves along one wall with mason jars and paint cans, and in the far corner a workbench that hadn't been touched in years. I looked for the usual signs: scat, hair on a splinter, greasy rubs along a corner where something with fur had been squeezing through the same spot every night. Found the scat first, in a little pile behind the water heater. Wrong. Not raccoon. Too small, too dry, and it had bits of what looked like bone in it. I turned it over with the tip of my knife and set it aside. Then I found the entry point. Gap where the concrete met the wooden sill, about the size of a softball, and along the edge of it was fur. Dark, almost black, coarse. I put some of it in a Ziploc and clipped the bag to my belt. Whatever was coming in wasn't a raccoon. I could feel that already, but it wasn't my job to identify it before I trapped it. So I set the biggest cage I had, one of the 2-door steel ones I use for feral hogs when they're on the small side, baited it with sardines and peanut butter on a piece of bread. Standard, works on almost everything with a nose. I told Marcel I'd be back the next morning. He nodded, looked at his shoes, closed the door before I was off the porch. That night I looked at the fur under my desk lamp. Coarse, black, with a brownish undercoat. I've been doing this work for 11 years. Raccoons, possums, nutria, feral cats, coyotes, one bobcat that got into an attic in Zachary. This didn't match anything. I put the bag in a drawer and figured I'd sort it out when I saw the animal. Next morning, I drove out a little before 8. Overcast, the kind of gray that means rain by lunch. Marcel's truck wasn't in the drive. I went around the side, unlocked the basement door, and stopped on the top step. The cage was full. I couldn't see clearly at first, because the thing in it was pressed against the back corner, and my flashlight caught its eyes before it caught the rest. The eyes were wrong, set too close together and too far forward, more like a person's than an animal's. Yellow-green. When I came down the last 3 steps and got the beam on it properly, the rest of my brain started catching up and refusing to catch up at the same time. It had the face of a cat, small, flat, tabby-patterned, ears pointed and swiveled toward me the way a cat's do. But the body underneath the face wasn't a cat. It was long and lean, with real hands. Not paws, actual fingers, 4 on each side gripping the bars. The back legs were folded up under it in a way no cat sits, knees pushed out, feet flat. There was a tail, long and thin, hairless at the tip, curled around one of its own ankles. Maybe the size of a large house cat, but stretched. Wrong proportions. It didn't hiss, it didn't chitter. It just watched me and breathed through its mouth. Slow. I've caught a lot of animals. Most of them freak out in the cage. They throw themselves at the bars. They scream. They bite at anything you put near them. This thing was calm. Not tame, more like it had been in a cage before and knew that fighting the cage didn't work. I stayed on the bottom step for a full minute, just looking. My hand was on my phone before I'd decided to reach for it. Took 2 pictures, one wide and one close, then went back up the stairs and called Marcel. He picked up on the second ring. "I got what was in your basement," I said, "but I need you to come look at it because I don't know what I'm looking at." There was a pause, not a shocked pause, a thinking pause. "Ah," he said. "Ah, that is mine. Let him go." I said, "What?" "Let him go, please. He got out of the pen. He come back if you let him go." I stood there in his yard with the phone against my ear and the smell of the basement still on my sleeves. Couldn't think of anything to say that would sound normal, so I asked, "What is it?" He hung up. I called back twice, straight to voicemail. His truck was still gone. The porch light was still on from the night before, which is the kind of detail I only noticed later, when I was writing it down. I went back into the basement. The thing was still watching me from the corner of the cage. When I got closer, it made a sound, low in its throat, that wasn't a growl or a purr, something in between, and shaped, almost, like it was trying to say a word and couldn't find the shape of it. I opened the cage door. The door swung outward and tapped the concrete with a soft ring that seemed louder than it should have in that small room. The thing tilted its head. I don't know why I opened it. Part of it was that Marcel had told me to, and Marcel was the client. Part of it was that whatever this animal was, I didn't want to be the guy holding it when someone came looking. It didn't come out at first. It sat and looked at the open door. Then it walked out, and I mean walked, on those back legs for 2 or 3 steps before it dropped to all 4s and slipped through the gap in the sill without a sound. Just gone. I stood there another minute, long enough to notice that the shelves along the far wall weren't just paint cans. Behind them, on the top shelf, were 3 empty pet carriers, airline crates, clean, no dust on them. Somebody had used them recently and put them back. I didn't touch anything else. Locked the basement door, put the key on Marcel's porch railing, and drove home, the long way. That evening, I called a guy I know from the state, a wildlife biologist named Roy, who used to teach at LSU before he went into consulting. Sent him the 2 pictures. He called me back inside of 10 minutes. "Where did you take these?" he said. First thing out of his mouth, no hello. I told him. He was quiet, and then he said, "That's not an animal that exists in the wild. That's a crossbreed somebody made in a basement. Possession of something like that is illegal. I don't know what the parent species even are, but whatever it is, it shouldn't be alive." I asked if I should call the sheriff. He said no. Call the state wildlife people and the Humane Society at the same time, tonight, and don't go back to the property alone. I made the calls, took most of the evening, gave them the address and the pictures and everything I could remember. They went out the next morning. 2 trucks, an animal control officer, a state investigator. Marcel wasn't there. His pickup was gone. His clothes were still in the closet, but the shaving kit and the phone charger and the little tin of coffee he kept on the counter were gone with him. They went down into the basement. The investigator called me that afternoon. He said, "How many did you see in the cage?" I said, "1." He said, "There were 5 more in the back room, behind a false wall, all alive, all different. We don't know what to do with them yet." He asked if I'd be willing to sign a statement. I said yes. Then I asked him what they looked like, and he said he wasn't going to describe them over the phone. I never heard from Marcel. The house sat empty through the summer. In August, somebody bought it at auction and gutted the basement down to the studs. I drove past once, on a job in the same subdivision, and the new owner was out front planting a tree. I never asked what happened to the animals. That's today's batch of stories, everyone. If one of them stood out to you, write it in the comments, and leave a like if you want more episodes like this. 4chan has plenty of strange corners, and sometimes we find posts there that feel a little too human. That's usually where the fear sneaks in. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.